Imagine a room in Tehran. No windows, no cameras, no record. It is a room where power goes to be spoken about in whispers, where men in clerical robes weigh the futures of 85 million people, where succession is not planned, it is feared. Now imagine that room the moment a phone rings inside it. And imagine what happens when the man who has held the Islamic Republic together for 3.5 decades, the man who has outlasted 8 American presidents, survived 2 assassination plots, navigated 4 wars on his borders, and watched the Soviet Union fall, the Arab Spring rise and collapse, and the nuclear deal nearly save then nearly destroy his country when that man simply stops. What happens in that room? What happens in the streets outside it? What happens in the missile silos, the proxy networks, the intelligence agencies, the neighboring palaces, the Washington Situation Rooms, all within the same 72 hours? This is not a hypothetical. It is an emergency that has been quietly prepared for, dreaded, and deliberately avoided for years. Every regional power has a contingency plan. Every militia has orders. Every intelligence agency has watched the health reports, the public appearances, the subtle changes in posture and pace. The question is not whether Iran's leadership will one day change hands. The question is what that change could set in motion. This video is about a single event that has not yet happened, and may reshape the Middle East when it does. We're going to examine who holds power in Iran today, what holds that power together, and what happens to the seams when it's gone. We're going to look at the factions already in position, the men who have spent years engineering their ascent, and the forces outside Iran's borders who are watching them. We're going to trace the scenarios, not the ones that look good on paper, the ones that have actually kept analysts awake for 20 years. And at the end, we're going to sit with a question that has no clean answer. Is the death of one man more dangerous than his continued rule? He was not supposed to be supreme leader. When Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini died in June 1989, the system he had built was designed to pass authority to the Grand Ayatollah Montazeri, a religious scholar of higher traditional rank, a man with doctrinal credibility that no one could dispute. But Montazeri had made the mistake of publicly criticizing the mass executions of political prisoners in 1988. He had written letters. He had questioned the direction. He was sidelined within months. And Ali Khamenei, at the time a mid-ranking cleric, a president, a man with no senior theological credentials, was elevated instead. The Assembly of Experts changed the Constitution overnight. They lowered the religious qualification required to become supreme leader. They reshaped the office to fit the man rather than the man to fit the office. Khamenei understood what this meant. It meant his authority would never rest comfortably on religious legitimacy alone. It would have to rest on something harder, colder, and more durable: institutional control. Over the following 3 decades, he did exactly that. He placed loyalists at the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, which grew into not just a military force, but an economic empire, a construction conglomerate, a network of companies and ports and infrastructure projects that embedded the guards into the Iranian economy so deeply that removing them became structurally impossible without collapsing the system itself. He cultivated the judiciary. He shaped the Guardian Council, the body that vets candidates for election and that can disqualify any politician it finds ideologically insufficient. Over time, that body became a filter that ensured the political landscape could only produce outcomes within a range he found acceptable. And he did something subtler than all of that. He made himself the indispensable interpreter. In a system built on religious law, where every major decision carries theological weight, Khamenei positioned himself as the final authority, not just politically, but doctrinally. His fatwas, his pronouncements, his silences, each carried the force of settled law. Reformists who tried to argue from within the system found the argument always ended at the same wall: the supreme leader has spoken. Over 3 decades, that wall became load-bearing. He wove the Islamic Republic into a knot that only he knew how to hold, and now he is old. Born in 1939, publicly acknowledged cancer in 2014, according to leaked documents reported by major outlets. Hobbled increasingly by physical limitations, the state television cannot fully hide, absent for long stretches. Appearing in carefully controlled footage, he is not immortal. And the knot he tied, the knot that requires his hand to stay knotted, is the most dangerous thing in the region. The Islamic Republic has a formal answer to the succession question. The Assembly of Experts, 88 elected clerics, is constitutionally empowered to select the next supreme leader. They can do it within hours. They have done it before. It is, on paper, an orderly process. But on paper is where the orderliness ends. The Assembly of Experts is itself a body whose members have been vetted and filtered by the Guardian Council for decades. That means its composition reflects Khamenei's preferences about who gets to choose his successor. In effect, the succession process is, by design, a loop that runs through him even after he is gone. The leading internal candidate, discussed openly in Iranian politics and regional analysis, is Mojtaba Khamenei, the supreme leader's son. He is not a senior cleric. He is a security operative, a man with deep ties to the IRGC and the intelligence services, a figure who has operated largely in the shadows of his father's authority. His elevation would represent something the Islamic Republic has never officially been: a dynasty. There are other names. Ibrahim Raisi was one of them until his death in a helicopter crash in May 2024 removed him from the equation. The coincidence of timing the region absorbed with quiet, anxious attention. There is no obvious consensus candidate, and in the absence of consensus, factions do not wait patiently. They move. Think of the Islamic Republic not as a government, but as a coalition held together by a gravitational center. Remove the center, and you do not get collapse. Not immediately. You get acceleration, every faction moving toward what it was always moving toward, but faster, without the counterweight that had been holding it back. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, known by its initials IRGC, is the most powerful faction in material terms. It controls missiles, proxy networks across 4 countries, the nuclear program's security architecture, and foreign intelligence operations. In 2024, it conducted direct strikes on Israeli territory for the first time in history. It has spent years preparing for a war it publicly says it does not want, and privately may believe is inevitable. The clerical establishment, what remains of traditional Shia Islamic authority in Qom, is a different animal. Many senior Grand Ayatollahs have been quietly skeptical of the Supreme Leader model since its inception. Some have theological objections to the very concept of velayat-e-faqih, the rule of the jurist, that underpins the entire political system. In the transition period, their silence would be a resource. Their opposition would be a crisis. Then there are the reformists, beaten back, arrested, disqualified from elections, yet never extinguished. They have networks in the universities, in the professional classes, in the diaspora. They have the memory of 2009, when millions came into the streets and were turned back by force. They have been waiting, not with patience exactly, but with the particular endurance of people who have no other option. And threading through all of these is a population that is younger than its government by 20 years. A generation that barely remembers the revolution, that watched the economy corrode under sanctions and mismanagement, that has protested and been killed and protested again. These are not abstract political forces, they are loaded chambers. The supreme leader has spent his career keeping them pointed in different directions. His death is the moment they turn and look at each other. The Middle East does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a state of permanent, managed tension, a web of deterrence relationships, proxy arrangements, back-channel communications, and red lines that have accumulated over decades. Every state in the region has built its security posture around assumptions about Iranian behavior under Khamenei. Not because they trust him, but because they can model him. Israel's posture toward Iran has been defined by a specific strategic calculus. The threat is real, it is growing, and it can be managed through targeted action, intelligence operations, and the credible threat of overwhelming response. That calculus depends on an Iran that is rational, that calculates costs, that has a leadership structure, that is afraid of certain things in predictable ways. A post-Khamenei Iran is not that Iran. If leadership is contested, if internal factions compete for control, if Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders see the transition as an opportunity to demonstrate irreplaceability, then the assumptions that underpin deterrence break down. Saudi Arabia has spent 4 years quietly recalibrating its relationship with Tehran. The Abraham Accords reshaped the regional architecture. A normalization agreement with Israel was in motion. The logic was that the region is too expensive to fight over forever. But that logic was written for a stable Iran, an Iran that continues to function as a known quantity. The Gulf states understand something viscerally that Western analysts sometimes miss. An Iran in chaos is not a weaker Iran. It is a more dangerous one because chaos produces accidents, and accidents in this particular neighborhood have a history of becoming something else. Iraq sits directly on the fault line. Its government is a coalition held together partly by Iranian influence and partly by the desire not to become a battlefield again. The Shia militias operating inside Iraq maintain dual loyalties, to Baghdad in theory, to Tehran's axis in practice. If Tehran's axis fractures, those militias do not simply stand down. They start making their own calculations. Turkey is watching from a different angle. Ankara has spent years running a pragmatic parallel track, maintaining economic ties with Tehran while competing with it for influence in Syria and the Caucasus. A weakened Iran is not a strategic gift for Turkey. It is a complication. A vacuum of that magnitude on Turkey's southeastern border invites exactly the kind of chaos, from refugee flows and militia spillover to great power intervention, that Erdogan's foreign policy has been constructed to avoid. The common thread, from Riyadh to Ankara to Tel Aviv to Baghdad, is the same. Every regional actor built its current strategic posture around an Iran that behaves predictably, not benevolently, not peacefully, predictably. And in the space between predictable and unpredictable, the entire security architecture of the Middle East becomes, at best, provisional. Slow down here, because this is where it matters most. There are two categories of risk that analysts return to again and again when they model a post-Khamenei transition. Not because they are inevitable, because they are plausible. Because the architecture of the region has created conditions where, under the right pressure, they become possible. The first is the power vacuum provocation. In the days or weeks following the Supreme Leader's death, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, or a faction within it could conduct an operation. Not a massive war, something smaller, a missile strike on a specific target, a proxy action in Iraq or Syria, an escalation with Israel in Gaza's aftermath. The logic would not be aggression for its own sake. It would be a demonstration, a message sent to internal rivals and external adversaries simultaneously. We still function. We still control the levers. Do not test us in this moment. The problem with that logic is that the recipient of such a message, Israel, the United States, Saudi Arabia, cannot simply absorb it. Not in a region that spent the last 2 years watching Iranian proxies strike everything from Red Sea shipping lanes to American bases in Jordan. Not in a political environment where restraint reads as weakness, and weakness invites the next provocation. And so one demonstration becomes one response, and one response becomes an escalation ladder. In a moment when no one in Tehran has the authority to decisively say, stop. The second scenario is internal collapse bleeding outward. If the succession is contested, if Mojtaba Khamenei's elevation triggers IRGC factionalism, or clerical rejection, or public uprising, the Islamic Republic faces something it has not faced since 1979. An existential crisis of legitimacy. States in existential legitimacy crises do not typically de-escalate their foreign policy. They externalize. They need an enemy. They need the rallying logic of threat. A fragile Iranian leadership facing domestic collapse is one that might accelerate the nuclear timeline, not to use a weapon, but to hold one. Because a state with a nuclear weapon is a state that cannot be dismantled from the outside, and an Iran racing toward a nuclear threshold under a new, unproven, internally embattled leadership is the one scenario that has always had the capacity to produce the one thing every regional actor has spent decades trying to prevent: a preemptive Israeli strike. Not a cold calculation, a desperate one, made in the worst possible hour, under the worst possible pressure, by leaders on both sides who have no relationship with each other, no established back channels, no shared map of what the other side considers an absolute red line. The spark in this scenario is not one decision. It is the absence of all the structures, personal, institutional, informal, that have historically prevented the worst decision from being made. Let's stay in the first 72 hours, not in the war, in the silence before it. The announcement of the Supreme Leader's death would not come immediately. The Islamic Republic is a system that manages information as an instrument of power. The first hours would be controlled. State television would run solemn music. Senior officials would appear in rehearsed composure. The succession process would be described carefully as orderly. But information does not stay controlled. Not in a country with 60 million smartphones. Not in a region where every intelligence agency is watching every signal. Within hours, the real architecture would begin to move. Not on television, in encrypted messages, in calls between Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders, in the deliberations of the Assembly of Experts under conditions that no external observer can fully map. In Washington, the Situation Room would be active within minutes of the first credible report. Not because the United States would want to act immediately, but because every ally, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates, would be demanding to know, what do you know? What do you intend? What are you prepared to do? Israel's Air Force would go to heightened readiness, not necessarily to strike, but because the cost of being caught unprepared in a transition moment is too high to accept. And once you are at heightened readiness, the other side sees you at heightened readiness. And what looks to you like prudence looks to them like preparation. In Beirut, Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful proxy, its most capable external military force, would face a command question it has never faced before. Hezbollah's relationship with Tehran is not simply ideological, it is operational. Instruction, resources, strategic guidance, they flow through established channels tied to specific figures in the Iranian security establishment. If those channels are suddenly unclear, suddenly contested, the organization does not simply pause, it waits. And in the waiting, every miscalculation is a step closer to the edge. The 72 hours do not produce a war. They produce conditions in which a war becomes possible in ways it was not before. In 1979, when the Shah fell, almost no one predicted what came next. Not the CIA, not the State Department, not the regional leaders who had spent years building relationships with the monarchy, not the Iranian intellectuals who had dreamed of a democratic republic and who would spend the next 4 decades watching something else take shape. The people who were most certain about what would follow were the ones who turned out to be most wrong. There is a pattern in that. The Middle East has a history of producing moments that analysts describe as manageable right up until they are not. Moments when the architecture of deterrence and mutual fear that has kept the worst outcomes at bay for decades suddenly encounters the one variable it was not designed to handle, not an enemy, not an attack, an absence. Ali Khamenei has been, for 35 years, a fixed point in the geography of regional power. Not a benign one, not a peaceful one, but a known one, a calculable one, a figure around whose behavior entire security architectures have been built. What comes after him is unknown. What comes after him may be more hawkish, more fragile, more desperate to prove legitimacy through confrontation. Or it may be something else entirely, a figure who sees, finally, the exhaustion of a system that has spent half a century burning its own people for the sake of a revolution that most Iranians were not alive to witness. The honest answer is that no one knows. What we do know is this: the Islamic Republic was designed to be permanent, built with redundant institutions, overlapping authorities, interlocking power structures, all of it engineered to survive the death of any single man. Khomeini built a system that did not require him, or so he believed. What Khamenei built is different. He built a system that requires him specifically, a system where the load-bearing element is not the institution, but the person holding the institution together. That is not a sign of strength. It is the signature of a structure that has been hollowing itself out for decades, shored up by the same hand that shaped it. When that hand withdraws, the question is not whether the structure will show its weaknesses. The question is how loudly. And in a region where certainty has always been the most dangerous illusion, where the wars that no one wanted somehow kept happening anyway, that uncertainty is not just a geopolitical problem. It is the condition the region will have to live inside, for however long the silence lasts.